Hey guys, this week my dad somehow tricked Brandon Busteed into coming on the pod, and it was amazing. They talked all about the future of higher education, the winners and losers, the need for dynamic leadership, and so much more. It is safe to say this is our best episode yet. You are gonna love it.
Will the traditional college campus even be relevant in the future? Today, it seems that everything in higher education is in question. Now, more than ever, it's important for us to have those tough conversations about what the future holds. Join me as I talk to the placemakers, those professionals who are in the business of making college campuses places where people want to be. Each week, we'll explore the future of the college campus in a very uncertain world. From the Collective Good podcast, this is the Placemakers series by MSCU, and I'm your host, TJ Logan. And we are live. We are back on the Placemakers at my favorite time of the week. It is the time when I get to hang out with my friends who are cooler and smarter than your friends to talk about the future of higher education. Today's Placemaker really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Brandon Busteed is joining us from what I can only presume is the future to tell us what's going to happen there. He is the president of University Partners and global head of the Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan. And he writes for Forbes and The Economist and does all kinds of conversation around the future of higher education. Brandon, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you coming on the Placemakers. And I want to jump right in. You talk an awful lot about work readiness. You talk about the preparation of our students for the real world and the 21st century work environment. And I actually caught your webinar recently on the gap year. And my big question coming out of that, because I think Michael Sorrell's doing this at Paul Quinn, but I don't see anybody else really doing it. And you're saying there's going to be a lot of people that want to take up a gap year because they want to start to prepare themselves for the real world and for work. And it's a good option. Can we incorporate the gap year in a smarter way within higher education? Or is it a gap year or higher education? Do we have to be losers in this as an industry? Or is there an opportunity to be more thoughtful in how we incorporate?
Well, it's a good starting point in terms of a question. And I was talking about it earlier with an NPR reporter this morning who was asking about the boost year concept that Kaplan just launched. And
Right.
what I said was, even though people are talking about it as a gap year type alternative, we actually designed it to reinvent the internship. And I don't need to go into great details about what it is, but here's the backdrop of that, TJ, and then I get to your question about where higher ed's role in this is. Today's 18 to 24-year-olds are the least working generation in U.S. history. So let's just start there, right? The least likely to have worked in any form or fashion over 70 years of measurement, right? So the least working in U.S. history. On top of it, the biggest critique of higher education, maybe second only to the cost, is the lack of belief in the work readiness of college graduates, right? Like there's essentially no one that believes college graduates are work ready. And of course, they don't believe high school graduates are work ready.
Right.
So you go, okay, there's no vote of confidence in the work readiness of grads. This generation is the least likely to have worked. And you say, okay, well, how do you help get them work ready? And the formula is fairly straightforward, to be honest, right? It's a handful of things like, did they have a job or an internship where they were able to apply what they were learning in the classroom? In other words, that those things actually feed off of one another. They see the synapses firing, if you will. And, the others would be work-like projects, right? Did I do a long-term project that required a semester or more to complete? Those are the types of things that came out of the Gallup research that I was involved with that double somebody's odds of being successful in their work later in their life. So you say, okay, well, great. Doesn't every college student get something like that? And the answer is less than a third.
Wow.
Less than a third of college graduates are leaving with a job or an internship where they applied what they were learning. Less than a third had a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. And so now rewind the clock all the way back to the beginning of your question. You say, okay, what do we need to do to get people work ready? My vote in this, which I'm voting with my feet in the work we're doing with Kaplan, is we need to get ahead of this and say, okay, before I go to college, before I choose a major, by the way, 40% of us regret our major.
Right.
So there's huge major regret. What are the ways that we get in front of it? Don't save work readiness to senior year, right? When you visit the career center, or to senior year when you do a capstone course, or, it's like bring it forward in a way where students can actually experience the world of work in ways where they understand what is out there, right? What types of different jobs and roles are out there, which ones are fast growing, right? And have an understanding of what it's like to, to touch that kind of work, right? So to have some hands-on application with that. Here's the point. We can do this in high schools. We can do this at the collegiate level, but it's going to need the help of multiple parties. So in any situation, whether this is being done by third parties outside of higher ed, or higher ed ramps up and prioritizes work readiness, we still need the students to understand how important the work aspects are, because right now they've been told grades and test scores is everything that matters, right? And oh, by the way, pad your resume and show a whole ton of extracurricular activities. None of those really are valued in the sense of work, right? And if I'm going to think about what's the most valuable thing for my son or daughter to do, I would tell you, I prioritize work, internships, co-ops, whatever we want to call it, over almost anything. And it's not to say I'm going to trade off grades entirely, but here's a great stat for everybody to think about. C-level executives would rather have, and hiring managers would rather hire a B student with an internship than a straight A student who never had one. So they're not saying they don't care about grades, but they're willing to trade a whole grade point for that work experience. So yes, colleges need to get in this game. If I were waving my magic wand, I wouldn't let a college student get a diploma unless they had a job or an internship where they were able to apply what they were learning in that degree program. So higher ed can certainly create their own versions of a gap year or a boost year. But it's going to require, the real theme, let's not lose track of it. The real theme here is work readiness. What are the levers for producing work ready graduates? And the good news is it's not rocket science. It's basic stuff that we just simply haven't prioritized.
And it strikes me, we have all kinds of opportunities through student employment, through engaging people on our campuses already, and that we just simply don't do it. I think there are some factions of our campuses, largely in student affairs, where they look at, if you're a student who works in housing or student activities or, rec centers, things like that, that there's an emphasis on student employment in a little bit of a different way, in a developmental way, in an experiential learning way. But we're not doing that same thing in the food court. We're not doing that same thing at the local coffee vendor. We're not doing that same thing, in the libraries and places like that. Are we missing a whole opportunity to incorporate work into these small cities that we call campuses in a more thoughtful way? And is there an opportunity to potentially bring costs down as we do that?
Well, definitely. Look, I was involved. I'll give you a couple examples. I was involved in some studies where we were surveying currently enrolled students on a campus and asking about whether or not they felt like they had. One of the survey questions was a statement about, I had a job or an internship where I was able to apply what I was learning. Well, interestingly enough, 50% of all the students on this campus had a work study job on campus. Less than 4% of those said that they had a job or an internship where they were able to apply what they were learning in the classroom. Which is to say that no one, the students, the people they were working for on campus, nor the academic, hub of the university were making any effort to curate that connection between the work study activity they were doing and their academic work. So just start there, right? We have these enormous missed opportunities. Don't make the assumption that just because someone has a job that, it's that they're magically, connecting it to the classroom.
Sure. Right.
And let's also not assume that, it's only really good jobs where we can learn from, right? And so I joke when I give speeches about my flippant example of flipping burgers at a fast food joint. And my point about it is that if I'm a student who has a faculty member or a teacher or a mentor, and we're thinking carefully, like, okay, that's my job. I'm flipping burgers at a burger joint for the summer. We don't think, maybe we don't naturally think that's a job you can learn a lot from, but that's up to us to figure that out, right? It's a lack of creativity to assume that even a job like that, it's like, okay, let's evaluate the supply chain. How did that meat get to my grill?
Right.
That is a fascinating, multidisciplinary topic. I could talk about, the management style of the general manager of that, facility. There is a ton that you could derive from that, but, teachers and faculty aren't helping pull that out. They might not even be asking the question of where I'm working for the summer. And I might not be thinking about, well, actually, yeah, there is a lot that I could learn here if I just open my
Yeah.
eyes to the idea that that's the case. So, it's a lack of creativity that we've all kind of brought to this, like students included, right? You can,
Yeah.
the proverbial lead a horse to water. You could mandate internships for students, but they're still going to have to take advantage of it. And right now, we just haven't valued work. I know a lot of well-intentioned parents who can afford to have their children not work, who actually say, no, 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 TJ, your job is to get
Right.
good grades, so I don't want you to work.
Right.
Well, you know what? I want my kids to work. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's going
Me
to
too.
be a really important thing for them.
Yeah. Well, and I like what you're saying about, creativity really on all fronts, because you can have I always use Saxby's as an example because I love what they do, but you can have a vendor like Saxby's come onto a campus and have a program whereby the student is the CEO and runs that shop and learns all the things about leadership and hiring and managing a
Right.
space. And that's great. But if the B school is not interested in partnering with Saxby's in a way that then takes what's happening in the classroom and connects those dots, then it's not as meaningful. So we
Right.
all have to come to that table a little bit. And at the risk of asking you to say something people wouldn't like to hear, I'm, we've heard over and over and over again about sort of faculty and what faculty's roles are, as it relates to the classroom and how they conduct themselves. And you hear the old adage of, those who teach because they cannot do. Now, I don't buy into that. However, there is this notion of a disconnect between what's happening in the academic circles and what's happening in the workplace. And I wonder your perspective on that. What role can faculty play, or what shifts can we expect from faculty to make that more relevant?
Yeah, look, the crux of this is we have to get to a place where work readiness sits at the academic core of higher ed.
Right.
Now, when I say that without any caveating and explanation, right, I'm sure there's a lot of folks who will cringe and go, well, what does that mean? Are we talking about vocational training? And there's this silly debate that continues in higher ed around like careerism versus the liberal arts, right? That
Right.
like, if we either teach the purity of critical thinking and, liberal education, or we devalue ourselves by being technical and vocational, right? And that whole debate I'm so tired of. Like it just, and it's not an either or. If we were smart enough to just kind of flap our
Right.
wings
I
a
was going to
little
say they're
bit,
not mutually exclusive,
they're
right?
not mutually exclusive, right? This is a both and so when I go back to this point about how work readiness has to be part of the academic core, there's a lot of reevaluating that higher ed needs to do, starting with the provost, the chief academic officers, right, who interestingly enough in surveys have really high confidence that their institutions are doing a good job preparing students for success in the workplace. In fact, of all the people and
Mhm.
different constituents that Gallup ever surveyed, they're the only group that has confidence in that, right? You interview the general population of the U.S. You interview C-level business executives in the U.S. You interview trustees of colleges and universities. None of them have a sense that we're doing a good job preparing students for success in the workplace. So, what does it mean to make work readiness part of the academic core? Something like what we've seen in the models. These are not, by the way, these are not new models.
Right.
Northeastern, Drexel, right? The co-op program, Drexel just celebrated 100 years of co-op. It's more relevant now than it's ever been, and I would argue that because this is the least working generation in U.S.
Mhm.
history, it actually is more relevant now
Right.
than it was when it was created 100 years ago. And so, but we need to bring academic credit to those experiences, right? So you mentioned Saxby's. What a great model where students can work in a real
Mhm.
business and operation, get credit for their academic work, right? The synergies that
Right.
feed off of one another for that
Get
are
paid.
amazing. You get paid. I mean, like
Yeah.
I can't figure out what the downside is in any of that. There just
Right.
isn't. But right now, with the exception of a program here or there really isn't a requirement to do an internship, with the exception of a Northeastern or a Drexel or a handful of other,
Yeah.
co-op institutions. That's not part of higher ed. And even, this is the first easiest step that I think faculty can take, right? Um, I don't think it's fair to assume that all faculty have worked in an organization outside of higher ed. Most of them haven't, right?
Right.
So we can help them understand that, hey, this work readiness thing is a really important part of what the ROI is for students, the return on their investment, their feeling that their education was worth it, is heavily linked to the degree to which later they feel that what they learned in their degree program is relevant to their work. So this matters a lot to students. It's the primary motivation for why people value higher education in the United States, is to get a good job. And again, this is not, mutually exclusive. You can have a well-framed liberal education with very specific work experience, skills, training, right? And now you've got somebody who in the marketplace is as hot a candidate as you can possibly find. In fact, we've even tested it. You say, well, what does an employer like a lot? I'll give you an example. An English major with a designation as a certified ethical hacker in cybersecurity. Put those two together, and you've got somebody that almost any employer wants to hire. I mean, the reason why I bring up the example is it's kind of a classically considered, liberal arts type of major with a cybersecurity designation. You put those combinations together and you've got a winning formula.
Well, and you wrote about the value of the liberal arts education and sort of that notion of pairing that with more, I guess you'd call it practical or tangible or whatever you want to call it, and how that creates sort of the work-ready grad in the 21st century. You also just referenced sort of generationally where we are, not just the lack of work, but that this generation's a little bit different, Gen Z, and maybe now is the best time for a lot of these things. There was an article that got published in Medium the other day by a young guy named Jabir McKnight, who he's a recent graduate from Lincoln, really cool guy. I had a chance to talk to him really quickly, and he talked about entrepreneurship innovation really being the key. Really being entrepreneurial and innovative. I tend to believe that higher education engages a lot in what I would call innovation theater. We love to pretend that we are innovative. We love to say that we're doing incubation, say that we're investing in venture at a very, very, very low level. But that oftentimes it's all just theater that is a curtain in front of a very traditional higher education market. What are the things that we can do to well, one is innovation and entrepreneurship are those values that we ought to really be instilling right now with our students, and finding ways to do practically, as Jabir sort of referenced. And then two, what are the ways we can do that?
Yeah, look, I think there is, your expression of, innovation theater, there's certainly a lot of that going on. And, it's interesting. You talk about entrepreneurship. I've been an entrepreneur. I've founded two different companies. I feel very much like an entrepreneur in the role I'm in now and the role that I was in at Gallup, and was involved in a lot of studies of it. And there's a couple interesting points, right? Like innovation in and of itself is maybe not the game changer, because any great idea still needs somebody to bring it to life, right? Somebody that marshals the resources, the people, the whatever it takes to actually, bring it to life. So for example, one of the biggest things that universities cite are, they get all excited about tech transfer offices and, patents and all that kind of stuff. And you look at the data on how many companies have actually sprung out of universities compared to the amount of funding that has been invested in it. I mean, it's a paltry amount. And even, so you say, okay, what's a better way to do this? Don't just think about this through the lens of tech transfer, right? Which has a very, very low likelihood of succeeding in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, you've got a couple big name, references you can throw out there, but for the most part, for most universities, it's kind of a dud of a function. It's really thinking about, okay, at the roots of entrepreneurship, it's people actually going out and doing something, right? It's really difficult to be an entrepreneur without actually getting your hands on a problem, trying to tackle a problem, right? Iterating over time. So you think about like what happens for successful entrepreneurs. They just go and they start making it happen, right? And so how do you create an academic environment where students are actually able to go do things, right? To build things, to create things, to manage things. And by the way, I don't think it's always that they have to start their own new business. So I forget what the number was, but when I started at Duke University, there were something like 220 student organizations on campus. Now there's something like 800.
Right.
Because what's happened is, every, super student leader who's come through the place started their own organization.
Right.
It
The
had four.
underwater basket weaving is now an org.
They
Yes.
were the president. It had four members. The vice
Right.
president, the treasurer, right, and so I'm not necessarily advocating for that either. But you go back to an example like Saxby's working in a functioning business, right, where you actually have a role, where you get to understand the finances of that organization. How does the cash flow work, right? And those are things that are really
Yeah.
valuable. We shy away from things like business education in the liberal arts. We
Mhm.
shy away from things like financial education. Even think of how helpful it would be to understand mortgages and home
Right.
finance and stuff that you really honestly get outside of
Right.
higher
Right.
education. And then I'll tell you another one. This is one of my pet peeves. No one wants to teach sales.
Life is
And
sales.
sales is the lifeblood of almost any organization, including nonprofits, by the way, because we just use a different
Yeah.
word. It's fundraising or
Sure.
development, right?
Sure.
But like, so
That's a
there's
great
there's a
point.
there's a bad word in higher ed that would be one of the most valuable things for people to understand. But we're just not
Yeah.
teaching it. And then, by the way, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you have to know digital marketing today.
Right.
So, is digital marketing really taught?
No,
No.
content creation is not taught. USC just came up with a program for content creation. It's the only one I've seen nationwide at this point. And you're really singing my song. I tend to believe that higher ed is set up in a way that dissuades people from being entrepreneurial. Even when you look at the metrics, when a student comes into an incubation space, as an example, that's hosted in an institution, if the metric is achieve a grade, you've already failed, because that's not the outcome that entrepreneurs should be seeking.
Right.
Are you setting environments where people are empowered to fail? Are you setting environments where they're going to learn the things they need to learn to be a successful entrepreneur? And again, that doesn't mean you have to run your own business, but it does mean that you need to be able to survive in a certain type of ecosystem. And all those things you're talking about, you're preaching to the choir a little bit. So one of my biggest questions as I think about this, we've had a lot of powerful voices um, as COVID-19 has come out as it relates to higher education. I think coronavirus, COVID-19, this quarantine, it's really been an accelerator for some of the change in higher education. I don't suspect that it's really created the changes, but I think it's accelerated the changes. Scott Galloway talks an awful lot about that, and I tend to agree with him. He tends to have that perspective of we kind of need to blow it all up. And then if you listen to folks like Michael Sorrell, he says we can reimagine it. And that's even on our podcast last week, Julie Payne Kirchmeyer and Josie Alquist talked about reimagining higher education and how do we become mission driven and hold on to certain things. Do you think it's possible with how big of a ship on the ocean that we are right now to really reimagine higher education, or by and large do we need to blow it up to move that bell curve to the right or to the left or whichever direction we have to move?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think we want to do things that just intentionally blow it up, right? I mean, there's the reimagine framework, the reinvent
Yeah.
framework. That's something that I think is the right way to think about it. Now, that said, there will be institutions that are just not going to be with us in another year or so,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And those are institutions that it's interesting when I hear a lot of the prognosticators talking about how many institutions are going to
Uh-huh.
go out of business or merge or whatever, otherwise be acquired. There's actually an increasing convergence in the prediction around those, right? There used to be Clayton Christensen like way out
Right.
on the far end,
Right.
and then other people were like, but now all of a sudden you're starting to see people, converge around somewhere between 500 and
Yeah.
1,500 institutions going out of business. Well, no one's saying less than 500 anymore. At least I haven't
Right.
heard that.
Well, Michael
Um,
Horn the other day said, a quarter in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, well, and
That's a
look,
lot.
that's a lot. That's a lot. And again, I'm not going to venture a specific number into it, but it will be a significant number, right? Now, here's the point: most people have been talking about this as the types of institutions that are going to make it or are not going to make it. There's probably some correlation to that, right? So if I'm a small institution, very expensive, not well known, like entirely
Yeah.
residential. I've made no investments in online, non-degree. Like, okay, there's some typology that will certainly be a disadvantage. That said,
Sure.
I think this whole ball game is going to be about innovative leadership, entrepreneurial leadership. So go back to your innovation entrepreneurship. we need that more at the president level and the senior cabinet level than we've ever needed it. And the institutions that are going to succeed and thrive through this are going to be the ones who have those kinds of leaders at the helm, right?
Mm.
So look, you take someone like Michael Sorrell. When he showed up at Paul Quinn, that place was dead. In fact, he almost thought his job was to go in there and spend 6 months and shut it down. But what was one of the first things Michael Sorrell did? Well, he realized they were losing a ton of money. They had a football program that wasn't a very good football program. So this guy goes in and decides, we're going to cut the football program. And what he also realized was they lived in a food desert in terms of availability of fresh, fruits and vegetables in the area where Paul Quinn is. And so he plows the football field under and turns it into a sustainable garden.
Unreal.
That the students work. Now, and that's just a very specific example. But what college president,
right,
goes in and goes, you know what? I'm going to cut football. We're going to plow the field under, and we're going to create our own sustainable garden. But he assessed the situation and realized that there were, roses out of concrete, right? An expression that I've heard him use before. So, I don't care what type of institution you are. If you've got a president like a Michael Sorrell at the helm, you're going to figure it out. And so that's a lot of what I've been spending my time doing, is trying to identify the leaders who are going to lead this change, irrespective of the institutions. And, you get that formula right, I'll bet on those people all day long, and I'll bet on the university that they're running. But we aren't talking about that much. We're talking about, the small private ones are going to go out, and the mid-tier ones, and it's like, no, show me strong leadership, because I'll show you poor leadership at a top performing institution, and I would worry about that institution even if it has a strong brand name.
Right. Well, and I think there are the institutions that everyone can point to in terms of dynamic leadership right now, or at least visible leadership right now. You can look at what Mitch is doing at Purdue. You can look at what Michael Sorrell is doing at Paul Quinn. You can look at ASU and Michael Crow and the way that they've named everything going through the quarantine and their different delivery models. Who else is doing this? Because it feels like, by and large, higher education is a follower of an industry. And I worry about the disadvantage that puts most people at. Who else would you point to and say, look, this institution is dying? Southern New Hampshire is doing some really, really interesting things.
For sure.
Who's doing interesting things?
Well, there's a lot. Check out Kevin Ross and Lynn University in Boca Raton. Dynamic president. Visionary plans for Lynn. They've been on just an incredible trajectory for a long time. Look for Catherine Rowe at William and Mary. Brilliant leader. I'm excited to see some of the things that she does there. You can go to a lot of places. Look at what Furman's done over the last couple of years under Elizabeth Davis's leadership. They're an institution that now guarantees every student will have a mentoring relationship, some sort of internship where they're able to apply what they're learning. So they took the findings from the Gallup Purdue Index and basically said, we're not satisfied that just some students are going to hit this. We're going to devise a plan where literally every student hits the mark on this. And so, you look at that and you say, okay, well, what's the big deal there, Brandon? The big deal is they're trying to go from naturally occurring a third of their graduates, and this is true nationally, a third of graduates hitting the mark on those things, to 100% hitting the mark.
Wow.
That is a revolution, right? And so it's not like they're doing anything new. Like, we're still talking about some of the fundamentals, internship experience, mentoring, whatever.
Yeah.
What's revolutionary is they're saying, we're going to make sure it happens for every student, not just by accident or not just for a few select ones in one program. Look, I think there's Chris Howard at Robert Morris University outside of Pittsburgh. There's another one to watch. There's just dynamic leaders. I mean, I could go on for a while. But,
but it's
point
still
is
only a small sliver, right? At the end of the day of the field, right?
Sure, yeah, but there's others out there, and I certainly don't know the full cadre of the 4,000 college presidents out there. I mean, I've had a chance to work with several hundred over my time, but anyway, I'm encouraged by those kinds of leaders. I'm encouraged by their examples. And they're going to be successful, and everybody else is going to have to start to follow the formula. And by the way, this is an interesting point. Higher ed loves the follow the leader formula, right? We've had a history of this. It's all about moving up the rankings and gaming that system as much as you can. If you weren't one of the first universities in the United States, right, you gotta do all kinds of things to kind of move up the ranking charts. But there isn't one formula. The formula that Michael Sorrell is using at Paul Quinn is
Right.
unique to Paul Quinn. The formula that Michael Crow is using at ASU is unique to ASU. Mitch Daniels' formula for Purdue is unique to Purdue, right? So if you're looking to just magically go, oh, that's my model, I'm going to replicate that. No,
Right.
this is about dynamic visionary leadership. These are leaders who are doing some things that, quite frankly, aren't very popular, right? Like freezing tuition
Yeah.
for 8 straight years at
Right.
Purdue. There's a lot of folks where that is not a popular idea, but he's stuck to that plan. And now,
Yeah.
compared to the rest of the Big Ten, Purdue is so much less expensive
Right.
than all the schools they compete with, and that's starting to matter as consumers take their pick
Yeah.
between
Well, and this
Purdue and
all
others.
speaks to a theme that we've seen over and over and over again on this show, which is that differentiation is likely going to win. And so, what you call dynamic leadership, I think trickles down to this notion of there is no
Yeah.
plan. It's that you have to differentiate and serve a purpose and a need that is probably unique. And that's where follow the leader isn't going to work, I don't
Yeah.
think. The other
Yeah.
thing you said the other day that really struck me was this notion that the institutions that are being innovative are accomplishing it by doing so structurally. Can you say more about what that means in terms of being structurally innovative?
Yeah. I think it's a really, really good point for higher ed leaders to think about. So I was on a whim, I decided to kind of host a monthly forum of college presidents, and one of the folks that agreed to join with us, Sanyin Chang, is one of the top leadership coaches and gurus in the world, and so she talks with 4-star generals and Fortune 500 CEOs, and I mean leaders of all types all around the world with her leadership coaching. But in any event, we were having a conversation about what does it look like to constantly be to have an eye on the horizon, right? And she said, as
Yeah.
college presidents, right, I'll just talk we as in college presidents. I'm not a college president, but college presidents have all kinds of issues they have to deal with. They have all kinds of constituents they have to take care of. And right now, especially in this time of COVID, the disruptions are endless, right? It's just like one fire after
Right.
another that I'm putting out. And by the way, that looks like a typical academic year anyway, without a global pandemic and all the things that are happening. And so she challenged the group by asking, do you have somebody dedicated on your team that's just thinking about innovation, that's just thinking about the horizon? Because if you don't have the time to do that all the time, right, somebody on your team needs to. And it was just a really good question. It was a very reflective question that everybody was, kind of paused on and thought, do I? Maybe I don't. Well, anyway, you think of the universities that have done this, they have institutionalized it. So one of the great examples to me is Wake Forest University, where they have a vice president of innovation, sits on the president's cabinet. His job is to think about new innovative things that happen, that could happen at Wake. And then on their board of trustees, they actually have an innovation committee of their board of trustees. I don't know. I can't think of another university that has that kind of a committee just focused on innovation, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some others out there, but
Sure.
that's an example of making it an institutional priority, carving out somebody's time and saying, this is what I want you to think about, you and your team to think about, and bring us any idea that you can think of, right? Some a little more far-fetched than others. That's fine. But you're giving permission to that, right? So it's the institutionalizing that priority of innovation,
Yeah.
giving somebody the space to do it, and then saying, like, don't give them total confinement, right? Like, some of the things that Wake has been doing, we worked with them on a partnership to launch a Center for Financial Services in Charlotte. There's no degree programs being taught there. They're all industry recognized credentials for the financial services industry in Charlotte. Wake has an incredible opportunity there, and a big mission driven opportunity to serve working adults and businesses in Charlotte. But it's not, there aren't degree programs. It isn't solving it with the typical thing that, higher ed likes to think of itself as delivering.
Yeah, and credentialing, I think, is a huge missed opportunity in higher education, both in terms of revenue and in terms of serving a very specific population. The last thing I want, because I promised I wouldn't keep you too long, but the last thing I wanted to ask you was, it strikes me that the cost of higher education continues to be an unsustainable thing to deal with. We've continuously failed to drive down the cost of higher education, maybe with one exception when you look at what Purdue's going on, or SNHU just cut some tuition. What are the ways that we're going to be able to accomplish what we want to accomplish in terms of making higher education relevant, making it sustainable, helping our students to be work ready, adding in entrepreneurship and innovation, making sure that faculty have a partner next to them that is an industry expert and an SME. All these things we want to do cost money. How do we do that and make higher education affordable? Because my biggest concern is when Galloway talks about the systems that we've created and the gap that we've created, particularly what's going on culturally right now in America. I have grave fears about who's going to be able to access higher education, who's not in the new world. How do we do both, or do we not?
No, we can. Again, it's not mutually exclusive to think about how do you increase the work readiness of students. The most obvious answers is that they work while they're learning. That could be, the work study on campus example. That could be, really any job. And, you look at where there's opportunities to disrupt higher ed. One of the articles I wrote last year that I argue would be, potentially the biggest disruption to higher ed is students just going pro early. And what do I mean by that? They take a job for a company that has an education benefits program that pays for their college degree. And in most cases, TJ, that's an online degree, right? But
right.
It could be from any number of highly reputable universities. You think about, one of the early deals in this space, the Starbucks and ASU partnership. I can work at Starbucks, make decent money. That might not be my long-term goal to work at Starbucks, but I can get my degree at ASU, right? Walmart, I can go to work for Walmart and get my degree from any number of universities. I can do that at Discover Financial Services. I can do that, at a whole host of companies that have now created those programs. Now, that's not for everybody, but here's my point. That model reduces the cost of higher education because here's what happens. The employers go in and they negotiate bulk rate tuition discounts
like
with
insurance.
The universities that partner, right?
Yeah.
And then for the student, right, who's also their worker, they get the increased benefits of productivity, longevity, right? The turnover rates of employees that go into these programs are much lower. They retain longer, right? And they're more productive in their jobs. So, suddenly you've got a win-win-win for everybody. You've got a university filling enrollments, right? You've got an employer who's growing and shaping their talent, retaining their talent, helping their talent become more productive. They're doing it at a fraction of the cost of what that individual student would have paid if they had enrolled on their own in the university.
Yeah.
And so, you think about it, like everybody's winning in that scenario. I bring that up because that is an example of how higher ed's cost has been able to go down at the same time that the work readiness of those participating in it is going up. Now, does that mean that everybody has to go pro early? No, that's not the case. But go back to my other example. If I'm going to have a job, I want to make sure that when I enroll in college, I'm thinking about how it applies. My faculty members are asking me what I do for work and trying to come up with relevant examples, right? If I don't have a job and I'm a traditional age student that's never worked before, I want to do project-based learning that mimics work. Right. Or I want to have some opportunity, whether it's a virtual internship, online internship or in-person one, to apply those things. Now, here's a simple point. That stuff doesn't cost big money. It requires time and effort. And I'll leave you with my own personal example at Northeastern University. I started a company in the year 2000 based in Needham, Massachusetts, a few miles away from Northeastern. We weren't even in the phone book, TJ, and somebody from Northeastern's co-op office got my phone number and called me up. And they were like, hey, can we come and talk to you about our co-op program? Well, at the time I was 11 employees. I had no interest really, but I was like, okay, fine. So somebody came out, they spent 30 minutes in my office. I learned about the program and I said, sure, we'll do a couple students. We paid them $14 an hour. They were with us for 6 months so we could actually give them real jobs. And I'll never forget the first person that we hired from Northeastern's co-op office was a young woman named Kimberly Durkin. And at the time, I didn't have a director of marketing. So when she came on as our co-op, I said, Kim, you're the director of marketing. Because I don't have one. And her job as a co-op student was the director of marketing at a startup firm in Needham, Massachusetts. Right. So, here's my point. Northeastern didn't spend a lot of money acquiring me as a co-op partner,
Right.
right? They had one 30-minute meeting invested in that of somebody's time that came out to visit with me. And for 11 years, we had, over the course of 11 years, my little company had 17 co-op students, and we hired 4 of them full time before they even graduated. So,
Yeah.
it's just, it blows me away that we assume that this stuff costs a lot of money. It doesn't cost a lot of money. I tell you what costs a lot of money: massive new buildings on campus,
Right.
right? Like, you could go on and on with the kind of building that we've been doing. And I got to be honest, there's not a lot of ROI coming out of that building. I mean, great, you've got
Yeah.
nice facilities, but there's no correlation between the facilities on a campus and the work readiness of graduates later in life. So we'll
Right.
start there.
Well, and I think you answered part of my follow-up, which would have been, in your example of going pro early and companies really coming to an institution and coming up with a discount rate and bargaining through that. Do students now find themselves in a position where they forego the traditional college experience? And I think your answer is not necessarily, because I hear a lot of people say, I value that experience, but maybe it's only for the elite. And what I think I hear you saying is not necessarily the case. There are solutions where you can do both.
Well, yeah, look, and I think, that you're going to see, we're quickly seeing new archetypes of students
Yeah.
splinter out in the midst of this, right? So there will continue to be students and parents who just deeply value the 4-year on-campus residential, I'll call it traditional college experience. They're going to be there, right?
Right.
But, now all of a sudden you're starting to see a portion of those carve out into this model of like, well, so I could go to work for an employer who pays for my degree. And yeah, I might miss out on some of that college stuff that would be pretty neat, but I can do college for free and I'm going to get valuable work experience. I'll take it. Right.
Right.
So you're just seeing the splintering of different student types out there right now. And so, I think in that lies entrepreneurial opportunities for universities, right? If I'm a university who's thinking about the consumer out there who wants college, but wants to do it debt free, well, employer partnerships is a heck of a strategy. Online degrees for traditional age students is a heck of a strategy. I mean, every working adult, non-traditional age student in America is basically working and doing their degree online.
Right.
Well, you're going to see more 18 to 22-year-olds doing that because they can stay at home, save money for that period of time, work while they're doing it, have more flexible hours for when they do their studies. And but what I'm talking about here is you're just going to see different types of students emerge in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Because these new things are available. And I'll tell you what coronavirus is going to do. There's little doubt in my mind. It's going to reduce the cost of college because colleges are going to start to say, okay, tell you what, here's the cost if you come on campus. It's the full tuition, room and board. And oh, by the way, you want to do your bachelor's degree online? We now offer it fully online at this price. And that's 20 or 30% off of the traditional.
And that's the ASU plan. ASU has said you can have this, this, or this, and there's 3 different options, and one's blended,
exactly
and one's
right.
not. It's a very thoughtful approach. And so this is normally the time that I would say that no podcast is good after 30 minutes, but that's not the case with you. We could keep you forever, but I've already kept you longer than I promised. We're going to let you return to the future where you clearly live. I appreciate you spending the time with us this week on Placemakers. It was a fascinating conversation. Next week, we're going to be talking about community colleges. So please come back and join us then. Thanks and have a wonderful night. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, DJ.
If there is anything we are learning during this quarantine, it's that content is king. Whether you're a higher ed pro who wants to start a podcast or a private student housing company who wants to host a webinar or virtual event, you want to do it with high quality. You want to align your brand with high quality audio, video, and stream live events that your customers deserve. Do what I did. Turn to our friends at Duo Studios. These guys can do it all. From streaming esports to hosting live events and making podcasting simple enough even I can do it. Make Duo Studios your partner in producing high-quality content. Visit them today for a consult at duostudios.org/placemakers. That's Duo Studios, DUO Studios.org/placemakers.